My name is Birk. I live in Stockholm in Sweden. I've been a developer, self-taught developer since I was 9 or 10 years old. Been in the game for quite some time now. I'm the CEO and founder of Polar, which is the creator platform for open source developers.
What open source means to you? Like why you decided to start this project, right?
So how's it going? Like how long have you been in, say, operation, right? Whether operating in production, let's say.
So how do you know that okay, I need to speak to this companies, or like how you bring the visibility of that particular open source within the organization?
How can the community work on helping push forward open source funding?
To help them actually get some proper funding and support for their initiatives, and hopefully be able to actually work on it even full time and create a small business around it if they want to. That's our mission.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of This is Tech Talks, and this is episode 6, and we are like really excited to have Birk with us talking about fixing open source funding, which is a very interesting topic, and this is something which also we like as part of This is Tech Talks, this is learning community. We are also like advocates for making open source funding more accessible to everyone. And that's why we decided to reach out to Berk, and he was so nice to accept our invitation and come to the show and talk to us. So thanks a lot, Berk, for doing that.
Of course, excited to be here.
And we have our co-host Jay, who was missing last week, and now we are missing Jay. No, sorry, we are missing last this week. So Jay is back, but yeah.
I'm
So
very
hey, Jay,
excited to talk
welcome.
about Polar today. Yeah, I've already signed up. I read through the website. I'm logged in. Maybe I'll write my first post later today. I'm excited.
Awesome. Glad to hear that. I'm excited as well. Hopefully, if you have any feedback, just send it my way as well. We're iterating fast, so
I'm gonna slide right into your DMs. Yeah.
Nice. Looking forward to it.
We are missing you last, so hopefully we'll see you back in the next episode. And before we start, but would you like to give a small introduction about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Birk. I live in Stockholm in Sweden, and I've been a developer, self-taught developer since I was 9 or 10 years old. So been in the game for quite some time now, and I'm the CEO and founder of Polar, which is the creator platform for open source developers to help them actually get some proper funding and support for their initiatives, and hopefully be able to actually work on it even full time and create a small business around it if they want to. That's our mission. Yeah, I think that's the short introduction to me.
Nice. Funny enough, one of the internal names for one of our APIs is Polar.
Oh, really?
Trellis. Yeah.
Nice.
So I saw it, I was like, oh, cool, nice.
So, but before we start, so I just want to understand, what open source means to you, like why you decided to start this project, right?
Yeah. All right. Okay, so I'll get real for a second and very personal, but so as I mentioned, I'm a self-taught developer since I was a young kid. Um, the reason behind that, and unfortunately, was my mom was at the time struggling with a few mental health issues, and that was really challenging back then at home. And so one day, my stepdad, who is an educated software engineer, came home with a computer to the house, and that's where I basically lived from that point on. And I played online games, and I was just like tinkering with this computer kind of nonstop. And then one day I accidentally just right clicked on this web game that was my favorite at the time and clicked this thing called like view page source. Didn't know what that was, right? And this gibberish emerged. And I mean, because my stepdad was a developer, like I remember thinking like, oh, this is what code must look like. I must have like somehow opened a secret door here. And I recognized some sentences from the game. And so I just like started copy pasting that into Notepad, I think it was back in the days, and started tinkering. And that's when my life just, took a path basically. And I mention this because ever since that moment, just the fact that you can like right click view page source and actually see how a website was constructed back then, before JavaScript obfuscations and all that stuff that we're doing these days, like I just started tinkering, right? And I started to kind of like understand and wrap my head around things. And that led me down the rabbit hole of like finding online communities and like SourceForge and all of these things that were the thing of the past before GitHub. And so open source literally like taught me how to become a developer. So ever since then, it's always been like super near and dear to my heart. And I haven't been an open source maintainer of a big project or anything of that nature, but every chance I got, I've been able to contribute back to the open source dependencies I've been working with in commercial settings, and just absolutely love the ecosystem. And yeah, so to me, it's just obviously it's powering everything around us today, and just it's the way for developers to help others just accelerate and not like reinvent the wheel. And so we can focus on moving innovation faster by just focusing on net new problems rather than all trying to solve the same problems, as well as just an immense treasure trove in terms of education, which is amazing.
It's actually like kind of unfathomable how much free information is out there, right? Like, it's funny. I'm the only person in my immediate family and extended family and like family up and down all over the place, even semi-related to me, that's in tech in any way, shape, or form. It's like most of them have no idea what I do. Right. And they have just like no concept of how, they've worked in traditional business and, mining or engineering and all this kind of stuff. Right. So this concept of this like unfathomable amount of free information just at your fingertips that you can acquire and use globally within seconds, it's just like mind blowing to them, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, it is. It's hard to find parables in other industries, right? And yeah, it is just crazy in terms of how much of all projects out there that is running to a large degree on open source software. It is just staggering that things are working, given a lot of the problems that also exist in the ecosystem as well. Funding being one of them, right?
Yeah, I don't think they believe me when I tell them. When I tell them like how much of the world is actually running on open source software, I don't think they actually believe me.
Yeah. And it's funny, the company I started before Polar back in 2011 was called Ticktail, which was an e-commerce platform that Shopify then acquired in 2018. So I worked there for 3 years. But Ticktail was a free platform to start an online store. And so when I talk about what I'm doing now with my mom or my family, right, like they think I kind of lost it, starting with like free online stores, and now I'm in free software, and it's just very unfathomable for them.
Yeah.
But just to understand, like, how did you got the idea for Polar.sh, right? I mean, we already have some platforms. So where you thought like, okay, this product which I'm building will fit into this category?
Yeah. So back in end of 2021, I quit Shopify because I knew I wanted to like build something on my own again, and I wanted to kind of go back to my roots of coding as well. And I was a new dad at that time, my firstborn son, and so I was basically walking a stroller and thinking about what I want to do next. And during that time, then I was just coding for the fun of it to get back to that again. And I had this idea of a small little service that I wanted to build. And long story short, I needed to basically offer like an OAuth provider as part of that service. And I had built that at Ticktail like 10 years prior in Python. And as developers, I think we all kind of, when we stumble into a new problem that we need to solve, we think, is there an open source solution that I can leverage here, right? 10 years ago, there wasn't for that particular use case. So I had to roll my own solution for like 3 weeks or whatever it took. And so now for a side project, I wasn't that interested in spending 3 weeks on that. And so I went to GitHub and I searched, right? And lo and behold, 10 years later, there was this library called authlib in Python. And so I could solve that same problem, but within 30 minutes rather than 3 weeks. And I feel cheesy for saying this, but I just like literally, I get goosebumps just telling that story, right? Because those moments happen when you like have built something in the past and then you stumble upon an open source solution and you're able to recreate that in a much faster timeline. And the code was vastly better because it's seen all of the different edge cases from different types of usage. And so I fell in love with the project, and shortly thereafter, see in the top right corner, they're getting like, I don't know, $5, $10, $15 a month from GitHub sponsors. And this disconnect between the value creation of open source versus the value received for the creators behind it, like I've always known that it is vast and that it's a problem. But I think everything, like stars just aligned. I was looking for my next thing. Like TikTok was about empowering people to create their own online stores or become entrepreneurs online. And this just felt like the perfect mixture of all of my interests and a challenge that was like very big that I wanted to kind of solve. So I just went down the rabbit hole, and long story short, like spoke to a ton of different open source maintainers and a ton of different companies to just like get a strong hypothesis on how I thought you could or should improve the situation. And the more time went, the more bullish and convinced I got that I had to do something in this space. And that's basically the story behind Polar.
Jay, you have any question?
Yeah, I'm really happy I'm here for this episode. This has been something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. So at my company, we're kind of trying to do a, not like directly, one-to-one comparison, but something similar with the charity industry and trying to help them, become more sustainable, see themselves more as a social enterprise versus like a charity, quote unquote begging for money, right? The classic like, oh, we're just collecting money for charity kind of thing, right? We want them to be more efficient and plan long term and like be able to do that kind of stuff. So I've always thought about what I'm going to do after Trellis, because there is going to be an after Trellis at some point, right? Whether that be in 2 years or 10 years. And I've always wanted to investigate what it would be like to try and change and improve the industry from the same point of view, but in open source versus charities. So like, I commend you for what you're trying to do with Polar for sure, and it honestly really excites me, because I've gone through that exact same thought process that you've gone through, right? Like it's absolutely amazing that you can start and build something so quickly with open source software, right? Like I'm an entrepreneur, right? So I want to be building and validating the thing that my customers want, right? I don't want to have to be spending my time building the thing that they don't even know exists, i.e., an OAuth solution, for example, right? No customers that the majority of software devs serve even know what the term OAuth is, right? But they do know what the term, e-commerce or, like product inventory means, right? So like build the things that matter. And open source allows us to use the tools to get to building that stuff quicker. Right away, effectively. At this point in time, with the open source, we can get to building our value prop right away and not have to worry about the rest of it. So, hats off to you, or toques off to you, because I'm wearing a toque right now.
Thank you. Well, I'm
or
excited.
beanie, as it's called in many parts of the world.
Yeah. Well, looking forward to chatting about this with you as well, then, to kind of see, what we're doing and our thoughts or hypotheses in the space, how they resonate, and if you have any other point of views as well. Like I think that's key for us. Like we have a very strong sense of our mission and what we're all about, but I think we've such a hard challenge to solve, right? Like we're very, very open that we have strong opinions loosely held in that regard. So we're just iterating based on our beliefs, but also the feedback that we're getting from open source maintainers, and drilling for oil and then just mining even more wherever and when we find it in places.
Totally. So how's it going? Like, how long have you been in, say, operation, right? Whether operating in production,
Yeah,
let's say, and
yeah.
how's it going with the open source maintainers?
So it's going good. Let's see, we've been live 7 months, I'm going to say. So we launched publicly in June of last year, towards the end of June.
Hmm.
But to give you some context there, so what we launched with back then was purely what we call our feature around issue funding,
Okay.
which is that very easily you can synchronize your GitHub repository and you can select which issues that might be some features where you would want to like offer your community to crowdfund and kind of vote which features would make sense and help support the development of those in particular, as well as like commercial sponsors as well, along with being able to split that with contributors as rewards and things of that nature. That feature has become quite popular, and especially amongst like larger open source maintainers, especially around
Mhm.
like sharing that with their contributors. So today we basically support open source maintainers that have several millions in GitHub stars collectively in total. But what we launched now in beginning of January, which was our longer term mission, is what we call the platform. So it's essentially going beyond that initial feature and really creating like the creator platform for you as an open source developer, sort of like the layer on top of GitHub that's missing, where what we've seen is maintainers are really successful when they upsell certain like features or additional value add benefits on top of GitHub sponsors. But all of that is entirely manual and a pain to deliver and consume as well. And so
Mhm.
that's where we come in. We're basically like automating those things in a really delightful way for you as a developer and your customers. And it's been really exciting since launching that. Like we've almost doubled the amount of developers on the platform since. We have developers trying out like the new features around upselling like private access to some GitHub repositories for like courses and things of that nature,
Mhm.
to just writing like updates and premium content around their project as well to their audiences. So they can offer that as a subscription. So it's sort of like
Mhm.
Patreon for the
I
open
was
source ecosystem.
I was just gonna ask how much, call it R&D, Robin duplication, did you do from Patreon's, value props, right? Because they've like it seems like they've kind of solved it in terms of the called the non-open source content
Yeah,
creator
yeah,
market, right? So like
yeah, yeah.
how much inspiration did you take from their platform?
Uh, not as much as you might think. I think
Okay.
the inspiration of Patreon is more like around the mission and what they're all about and what they empower. But as you mentioned, right, I think Patreon is an incredible platform if you're, say, an artist.
Mhm.
But if you're a developer, I think that's where Polar steps in, and I think you have very, very different needs and requirements. And
Mhm.
so I think the similarities there are around, updates and like premium newsletters, for instance, and the
Right.
subscription layer as a whole. But the value benefits that you offer as part of those subscriptions are very different on Polar versus a Patreon. So that's where we're, spearheading new territory and just like talking to developers and just scouring what people are trying to upsell through GitHub sponsors or just
Mhm.
what our gut tells us and what we would like to have ourselves, right? Um, so that's kind of net new territory where we're just figuring stuff out alone.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it's funny
Yeah,
because it seems like with Patreon, they're delivering the content creators are delivering some, whether deliverable of some way, shape, or form. Usually it's entertainment, right, of some sort.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and the consumers or like the users of Patreon are the ones that are consuming that content. But it
yeah,
kind of stops at that point, right? With open source, there's this like the chain continues down. And it's like, oh, it's not just like the person building the library that uses it. Now it's like all these, big companies and it's ending up in products that have millions of users. It's not like I'm
right,
subscribed to a
right.
Patreon of an artist and then I'm taking their art and I'm publishing a game with it, for example, or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
you're right.
yeah,
I think the compounding effects down the chain of because like every time this library gets used, the user base, quote unquote, grows exponentially.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's just like,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then open source libraries build on other open source libraries, and now it just the branches
Yeah.
explode, right? So you're
Yeah.
right. There's a
Yeah.
lot more to think about than just like the A to B, the Polar user to the open source user deliverable.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also a big thing for us as well is the commercial side of things, right? So if there's corporations or say Fortune 500s that are using this open source library as an example, it's not just the community element, like that's essential to us as well, of course, but how do we cater to subscriptions to businesses as well? And what are benefits and offerings that can help convert more businesses to actually become subscribers and fund and pay more meaningfully as well? And for us, that boils down to like our core hypothesis is donations and sponsorship are amazing when they happen. The problem is that they don't happen enough, right?
Yep, exactly.
And we think what's missing is basically like a lot of open source developers are doing a lot of value add on top of the open source library. And that's where we think we can really help facilitate that and package that. And that solves a lot of the issues when I've spoken to companies around how they can open up their wallets more behind the open source stack that they're building on top of. So it's catering to a lot of different audiences as well. And to your point, that there's that flywheel component that a user might have their own dependencies as well. And yeah, the chain continues.
You're speaking my language, Birk. You're speaking my language.
Glad to hear that.
I've been preaching this for so long, just in a different industry.
Yeah.
Oh, it's funny.
So it brings up my next question actually. So you just told you speak to open source maintainers and then you come up with the ideas, right? So I mean, you might have spoken to them and maybe you can like enlighten us with the issues which they get, right? I mean, it's like we know like getting open source funding is hard, but what you learn from those open source maintainers, what are the issues which they generally get?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and we can have a very long conversation on this. I would say if I would simplify things, there's sort of like two camps there. So one is, let's call it like the community side and just hygiene and making your project successful as an open source initiative within the community. And if we begin there, like a lot of the developers that I've chatted with is like the ones that are very, very successful. It's sort of interesting that it goes beyond just writing the code itself. Obviously, that's a huge part of it, that you need to create a valuable project or product. But to make it successful, just like anything else really in life, online, you have to be able to like market it and like promote it. And like what that translates to in open source a lot is around just sharing updates about your progress, like the vision of the project, progress towards that. And so a lot of that boils down to the public posts, premium posts, and newsletters that we have built in as part of our platform for developers to make that just super, super simple and encourage that and make it more fun and delightful to just build your own audience and keep them engaged. And then you can build an audience that you're in control of, because you can start with like free subscribers. And then you have a big audience that you can over time convert, hopefully, into more and more like paid subscribers from the community as well. So that's one camp. The other one, which I think is seen as the holy grail in the ecosystem, is turning on that faucet from companies, right? Like how do you get companies that are building on your project to meaningfully fund you? And so this is where it gets interesting and a bit tricky. So as I mentioned, like I've literally spoken to hundreds of different companies by now. And the story is always the same, which is in a lot of these cases, most of them would actually want to fund more, but it's really, really hard to motivate that internally for the reasons that in order to unlock substantial capital to invest, you need to quantify that internally into a narrative of like, what ultimately does this provide to the business, right? And I think the paradox of open source, unfortunately, is that it's immensely valuable in basically commoditizing the value, right? Right. And so that's the challenge, where funding and sponsorship alone doesn't solve that problem for businesses. And that's why we're focusing on what we're focusing on, because when I talk to all of these businesses, like educational material to their engineers, like premium support, like all of these additional benefits that some successful maintainers are upselling, like those help unlock existing and larger budgets within the organization. And so I think that's the key. And then for us over time, how can we then be helpful in like equipping you as a developer with the better tooling to do these kind of like sales processes without feeling like you're becoming a salesman and that you're still the developer first and foremost. That's a big focus of ours.
Yeah, it kind of boils down to, how do you get a for-profit company to pay for something they're currently getting for free?
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. What I will
Or how do
say,
you convince people that are getting it for free that are also selling their thing for free, i.e. other open source maintainers, to also support it down the chain when they're not getting paid for the thing that they're giving away for free?
yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly. One thing that I'll write more about in actually the coming days, I'm meaning to write a post on Polar myself about this, is I believe there's a hack to this that I encourage open source developers to try out, which is like, we'll work on trying to arm you with the tools to like really sell to these businesses, right, and unlock other pools of capital. But most companies out there actually have this budget that kind of goes untouched, which is like the learning and development allowance for their engineers.
Right.
And I think that's fascinating, because a lot of companies are giving like $2,000 a year to individual engineers in that budget. And they typically kind of spend that towards the end, just like, oh, right, I have that budget I need to burn before I lose it by the end of the year, right? And at the same time, those developers really want their companies to start investing in open source. And so I think this is where like premium posts and like content in general through Polar can be really helpful to kind of position those tiers for individuals, but individuals that are working at companies with a learning and development allowance. Because I think that's how you can like tap into an existing big pool of capital without a lot of additional overhead.
Right.
So yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah, true. Just another question on the funding from the organizations, right? I mean, so you said like you speak to organization as well. So how do you know that, okay, I need to speak to this companies, or like how you bring the visibility of that particular open source within the organization?
Right. So I think we'll do more like targeted approaches in the future, where like open source maintainers on Polar can opt in. Like the idea that we have currently is they can opt into a program if they're like eligible, and they can basically set up a tier that's sort of like the pre-configured package that we know is a good selling point for businesses. And then we can like, because it's on GitHub, right, and because there's GitHub stars and dependents and all of these things, then we can basically help automate identifying who are likely companies out there that are using your project already. And then we can help with like reach out to those companies and like a well-prepared pitch from the get-go across their stack of like, here's the package that you can get with Polar that will offer your business X, Y, and Z, and that you can measure all of it so that it's like a win-win for both sides of the equation. That's something that I'm really excited by. Otherwise, what I've done in the past when I chatted with like the hundreds of companies that I have is just reaching out to a lot of companies that are within my network, or that are operating in the open source space, or that are just like technical startups. This has been more like exploratory in terms of understanding their dependencies on open source, how they would want to fund open source, and like how we can unlock more of their capital to invest behind their open source stack as well.
this is very interesting problem to solve, right? I mean, who is using your open source project? Because I remember a year ago there was one open source project which enabled a service which actually tracks like where it is getting installed, and then there was a huge conflict within the community. I mean, even a lot of developers came against this open source maintainer. Of course, he was trying to just make some
Yeah.
living, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
cannot say he was right, but I cannot say he was wrong as well. So how
Yeah.
do you think like this problem should be solved? I mean, what's
Yeah.
the win-win for everyone?
Yeah, I think the challenge, not knowing that particular case, but it sounds like you're basically, adding something that introduces tracking to your open source library, right?
Yeah, like
And that,
telemetry, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And that, I think Scarf is a startup that does this in a great way. But I know there's been attempts in the past that does it in some shady ways, or where it like adds some console logs into your terminal and things of that nature, right? And I think that's where you can burn a lot of bridges. So you definitely need to tread carefully here. And my gut feeling is there's a Pareto to this, where just using like the GitHub data in terms of the stars and like who's engaging with your issues and who's jumping in on discussions. And most likely as a developer, you've had developers from those companies reach out about your project. So you kind of have this good understanding already about who's using it. I think that's the treasure trove in the mine you want to mine first, rather than going for the long tail of like, how do I track like all users at the end of the spectrum as well. I think you end up, you could risk more than you actually could gain. And so it's more about how do you position this openly to those developers at those companies, and then help convert those over organically.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of data that you can mine that's public, right? Like even just building a tree where, or like a directed graph, I guess, in development terms, of who's commented on an issue and who's commented on a pull request, what's in their GitHub profile, right? You could say for in the node ecosystem, you could pull from npm and see where the transitive depths trace through, because a lot of projects are actually published under a corporation's namespace, right?
Yeah.
So you can be like, oh, this open source project is used by this one, and it's used by this one, and this one's actually a Shopify library, right? So now you can make the assumption that Shopify uses all of those transitive dependencies throughout their chain, right? You can build this whole directed graph of individual users using it based on, call it, some kind of an action, right? A comment on an issue, opening an issue, opening a pull request, just commits in general, right? Track all the usernames and stuff like that, and build this whole graph of, I know who is interacting with it, and I know what companies are using it, and at least in the stuff that I can see. And you might be able to make the assumption that if they're using it in something that you can see, they're also using it in something that you can't see, right? Whether that be from the same registry or not, like theoretically, they use their own open source projects inside their corporation. Otherwise, why are they spending money on it, right? So,
Exactly.
You're right. There's a lot of public information out there that you can effectively just scrape, right, and just build. I mean, like, there's even APIs for it, right? GitHub has all kinds of APIs. So,
But I also think it's more even like basic tactics, right? Of like how do you actually just communicate this in like your README, that you're offering like a compelling commercial offering, right? And so I know this from Shopify and other places that I worked, right? That typically introducing an open source library into your stack, like there is this evaluation process, and to different degrees, right? And so these are developers on the other side, similar to us right here. And if you're able to actually offer like a package where you could get like educational material and premium content in terms of updates and future direction of this, roadmap voting in terms of polls, premium support, like all of these stuff that will help you automate and deliver in a seamless way. My hope is also that just their top of the funnel, that you will have like developers on that other side that have those learning and development allowances and that have that voice in the company that can actually start subscribing and becoming customers, top of the funnel. But then obviously, to your point, also equipping them with tools to proactively reach out to others that they identify as well.
Yeah, exactly. Very interesting.
Yeah.
I guess kind of, we're coming up nearing the end of time, but I think one big question, because we're also very community focused. I mean, open source in general is very heavily community focused, right? That's kind of like what we do.
Yeah.
How can the community work on fixing open source, or not fixing, I guess, but helping push forward open source funding? How can the community get involved?
Yeah.
Right. What can the individual do? Right.
Yeah. I think as an ecosystem, it's about just experimentation, and I think that's what Polar at the core just offers. Like, you can try different types of upsells as part of your subscriptions, and just like, let's figure out different models, whether that's everything from sponsorware to like maybe you do open core that fits with your community and project. Like, just being more open-minded and experimenting with these different models and subscriptions, I think is great, rather than the old, like, you had Microsoft and you had Linux, which is like free open source software, and there's like nothing in between, right? And then I think more what you asked is like, as just an individual, how can I help drive more funding within open source? And my answer to that would be like, if you're a developer working at, say, a company, you might have a learning and development allowance. Like, you have these tools already and these budgets at your disposal. And so I would just think like, what are projects that I really love and that we depend on, right? And where there's this like win-win, where I might be able to get like some premium content or something that will help me become a better engineer in regards to this library. And I know that I can immediately just take that budget from my learning and development allowance and just give that straight to the open source maintainer. Then I would just like reach out and say like, hey, X, like, if you set this up and you offer it like this, I'm able to expense that at my company. And, telling that to your friends and colleagues as well. Using those budgets and investing it in open source, I think, is a great starting point.
Yeah, I'm being completely honest. I'd never even considered using a learning budget to fund open source. It's actually a pretty genius hack, to be completely honest with you. Right? Because I think when we talk about open source funding and the struggles of making it sustainable, everyone always thinks like, oh, how do we get them to pay for the software? Right. And it's not, that's only one branch of open source funding, right? There's lots of ways to fund an open source contributor, and it doesn't necessarily need to be for paying for the use of Date FNS, for example, or something like that, right? You could pay for the ability to learn from the maintainer of Date FNS for how to use it correctly, right? And like that accomplishes the exact same goal, but it's an easier path, theoretically speaking. Obviously.
Exactly. And we're doing things like, you can be a premium subscriber to get access to this instantly, to this premium content. But then as a developer, you can, after say 30 days, you can open up to the public as well. And I think this is where hopefully sort of like some magic can happen, where you can invest in writing this content and it can help unlock these doors for better funding. But simultaneously, you're writing content that will also probably help you make a more successful open source project, where you help educate future contributors, future users, so that you end up with hopefully less issues and discussions that could be answered in like a deep dive article going into advanced topics, for instance. So
you're effectively you're getting paid to learn from your users, right? Like, your users are paying you to help you figure out what they need so that you can do it better to get more paying users, right?
Yeah. That's a great way. Yeah. and at the same time, like they're becoming better developers on that project, which benefits the company. Like that's how I see it. It's just like wins all around, and leveraging, I think, a pretty huge unspoken of budget that just sits there. That is very, very accessible, rather than trying to go unlock net new doors that requires, long sales processes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Makes perfect sense to me. Way to go on figuring that out. I know you're only 7 months in, so like maybe not like way to go yet on like succeeding and changing it, but like it seems like you're on the right path. So
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I mean, it's super, super fun and exciting, and yeah, it's a really rewarding project to work on. And we're built by the way, we're built open source ourselves, for everyone listening. So I think that's an important shout out to make also. So definitely check us out on GitHub and join the discussion there. And yeah, we're iterating constantly and just trying to find more and more ways to get more funding and paid subscribers to open source developers.
Interesting. So this repository is correct, right? Polarsh/Polar. That's the one.
Correct. Yes.
Oh, cool. I'll just add it to description so everyone can
Nice.
access it.
Nice.
Okay. I mean that was a great. I mean, to be frank, I don't want to end this, but unfortunately, Jay has to leave, and then we don't want to like we don't want to go for a long. Maybe we can do another episode in future. Maybe let's say 3-4 months down the line. So once you
Yeah,
have more
absolutely.
things to talk about, and we can see like if we can schedule one. But thanks again, Birk. Thanks again for your time. It was a really interesting conversation. As you said, like we love open source. We like to support open source, and having you on the show was like, of course, great experience. And I'm sure like a lot of people will learn from this, and maybe we get more support for open source projects which is out there.
I hope
I could
so.
tackle
And thank
I
you
could talk
guys.
about it
This
all day.
was fantastic. Yeah, same here.
Yeah. I'm sure we will at some point. Hey, maybe you'll come back to
Yeah.
Sweden. Yeah,
Yeah, we can just do
I
a
have been
live
wanting to
stream
get
for
back for a while.
yeah. Yeah, please do. And we can do a live stream for like 24 hours, just hashing it out.
Sounds
That
glorious.
Yeah.
yeah. So
Awesome. Well,
we asked like our guests to promoting something on the channel. So if you have, of course, we talked about Polar.sh, but anything else you want to promote, I mean, feel free to do that.
No, I think it's probably best to just leave with like one thing that people can check out, and that's Polar.sh, where we have our link to our GitHub repository, our Twitter, X, whatever, these days, and where you can obviously sign up, and it's super, super simple. It's free. I think that's an important quick thing to just mention. So it's free to try out and free to start, no monthly fees or anything like that. And our pricing model is that we take a 5% commission on funding and subscriptions that come in. So we're aligned in terms of making you successful so that Polar becomes successful as well.
Nice, thank you. So everyone, you can just go to the description and you will find the link to Polar.sh. And we'll be back again next week with the another episode. And it will be with Colby, who is from Cloudberry. So we'll be talking about the open source stuff he's doing at Cloudberry. And I'm a big fan. He has been doing some amazing work in the open source as well as content creation. So we'll meet you again soon. And meanwhile, have a great day and enjoy your rest of the day. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jake, for
everybody.
joining. Thanks, John.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, guys.